All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Encephalitis Podcast. My name is Prathapan, and I'm from Encephalitis International. Today, we'll be talking about clinical trials. To find out more about this important aspect of developing treatments for encephalitis, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Stacey Clardy. Dr. Clardy, or Stacey, is both clinical and research faculty in the Division of Neuroimmunology and Autoimmune Neurology within the Department of Neurology at the University of Utah and the Salt Lake City Veterans Affairs Hospital. Her clinical specialization and research focus is in the field of autoimmune neurology. Dr. Clardy is the Principal Investigator, PI, of the ExTINGUISH trial, a randomized clinical trial for NMDA receptor encephalitis at 37 sites, including 2 European sites, with enrollment having begun in early 2022. Dr. Clardy, or Stacey, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you're doing well.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to your audience.
Amazing. So let's start from the beginning. Could you tell us a bit about what a clinical trial is?
Sure. I mean, clinical trials are the essence of how we move the practice of medicine forward, right? Clinical trials basically take an idea that a physician or a scientist or a patient has that has gone through preliminary testing, right? So sometimes this takes the form of in the lab, in the petri dish, or sometimes animal studies, usually centered around a compound, but not always, like a possible treatment. And once it has made it through all of the preliminary testing, which can be decades worth of preliminary testing, then often a traditional clinical trial will look at bringing this to humans affected by a certain condition. And this is really the way that we find out in medicine if what we're doing, which often starts in many conditions as an off-label best practice, right, based on physician or clinician expertise. And this is how we prove that that's the right thing. And of course, this is critically important, right? There are just countless examples in medicine of where we thought we were doing the right thing over the years for patients. And until it's rigorously studied in a clinical trial in the real world with patients, we don't really know, right? This is how we sort out the bias, the theories, right? It's putting them to the test. You know, we always want to do the best for patients, but this is how we prove that in fact we are doing the very best we can. And so specific to encephalitis, I'll apologize now that I'm going to sort of butcher the pronunciation of encephalitis because I'm American.
That's all right.
To encephalitis, we have no FDA or EMA, depending where in the world you are, approved treatments, which means that we've never rigorously tested what we currently do to make sure it's the right thing at the right time for the right patient. And so the way by which we do this with just tons of safety controls and tons of experts involved to protect the patients is to try different ways, but to make sure that we're doing it the same for several patients in a row at several different hospitals or centers. And then we collect all of that and say, did we do it right or not? Who did better? Which group of patients with which treatment, right? And that the details of that are all prescribed in individual clinical trials.
And how important is it for people in general to be aware of trials and to participate in them?
Well, I think about this for me, we're all the patient at some point in our lives, aren't we, right? And so when I go to a clinician and I have a question and they propose, say, a medication or a treatment, right? The first thing that runs through my mind because of my training is, okay, did you just sort of say that because you think it's a good idea, or can you convince me that I should take that medication? Can you convince me that I should, I don't know, even do physical therapy, right? We have trials for all sorts of things. Convince me that I should do that it's worth my time, that it's worth my effort. And every time they give me an answer, it is based on the fact that those who came before me with a similar question participated in a clinical trial. So I would say, any advances in medicine any hope we have of doing things better today, tomorrow, 20 years into the future is 100% dependent on clinical trials. So I guess what I'm saying is it's absolutely critical to improving our health, to improving our longevity, to moving medicine along. One thing I think is important, and because I'm, involved in a clinical trial at the moment, when we bring this up to patients, prospective clinical trial participants, they often say, look, I don't want to be a guinea pig, right? And I get that, right? Because the first response is skepticism. I think, especially in the current environment of medical practice and science that we live in. And I think that's a good thing. And especially depending, on your background and your experiences and your prior interactions with the medical system, which are never universally positive for really anyone, right? I think it's a reasonable question, but I hope that it prompts, I hope that's a question, right? I always view it as a question. I view it when patients or loved ones bring that up as, tell me why I should do this. Is there a risk that I will do worse, right? In encephalitis, I think this is an easy answer because we don't have any approved treatments, right? I would love to be in the position, many years from now where I say, yeah, you know what? We have 5 approved medications that we know work. And so that maybe not, right? But right now we don't know for certain that any of the medications we're using or the timing in which you're using them, we just don't have that high level evidence. So I think when we sit down, when we take the time as clinicians to explain where we are with this, patients and their loved ones very quickly understand, oh, it's an interesting thing ethically. When one is involved in running a clinical trial or explaining a clinical trial or obtaining what we call informed consent, which is that discussion where you talk about the state of things and what you propose to do in that study. Very clearly, we try at all costs to avoid the sense that there might be a benefit to participating in the trial, right? We never, ever want to sort of, make a promise of anything or sort of coerce someone inadvertently or not, right? It has to be very much, yes, I want to participate in this. But I think about this from many angles all the time with clinical trials, because you may know historically, and I think certainly in the US, but internationally, clinical trials tend to enroll well-resourced people, very savvy people. And so I always want to sort of, have people think about that in the back of their minds, right? I'm not consenting your audience, but think about why that might be, right? Because you're very often followed so closely in a clinical trial. You have access to your team much more than you would sort of calling and struggling to get an appointment. And so that's not a benefit, right? But isn't it? Right? So these are things that I think some folks know very well in our societies and our cultures around the world. And I guess, speaking to you about this, not in a specific trial realm, it is worth considering that. Why is it that some people always do participate in clinical trials, right? Sort of turning that question and flipping it on its head. The one about, I don't want to be a guinea pig and this, that, and the other thing. No one wants to be a guinea pig, and that's not how clinical trials are designed. It really is not. They have to go through such rigorous processes to protect the safety of all participants, right? But I think that's maybe just sort of the knee-jerk reflex we all have is, oh, I don't want to be a guinea pig. I sort of want to get just what everybody else has been doing, whether or not what everybody else has been doing has any high-quality data behind it. So I would say, if I think about this a lot, obviously, if there's one sort of thing to think about, one sort of thing I would hope to convey, because at some point, many of us in our lives may be offered participation in a clinical trial, is to look in detail at that trial and ask yourself, not so much, is somebody trying to experiment on me, but like, might there actually be many reasons to participate in it, right? And it's a tough thing, realize that as well. An insider tip for those who are explaining the trial and consenting, they are really strictly bound to steer clear of proposing that there could be any benefit whatsoever, even if it turns out in the end there was.
Right, of course, yeah. Thank you so much for that answer. Kind of moving on to your own kind of experience, and you've touched on this. What challenges have you encountered when it comes to designing and implementing clinical trials?
I think the challenges are many, but all worth approaching. And for me, I've been very fortunate. I'm not doing this alone, right? There are hundreds of people behind the ExTINGUISH trial for NMDA receptor encephalitis. I mean, just so many experts, right? Who spend all day on one aspect of safety or data analysis or regulatory sort of reporting requirements. And so my role as the clinician, my role is to, have been part of the team that sees these patients that present acutely and then say, wow, we need to do better, right? I mean, I never actually envisioned myself as being involved in clinical trials, if I'm going to level with you. I was trained as an MD PhD in a traditional combined program where you learn bench science, right? And to take clinical questions and maybe go preclinical trial back to the bench, looking at assays and things like this. And still really enjoy that. But what happened was I was finishing my clinical training as a resident, or I guess registrar, or whatever the word might be in different countries. And I was nearing the end of that training, ready to practice independently as a neurologist. And a patient presented to the hospital, and I heard my other trainees discussing the patient in our just shared workspace, and my ears kind of peaked up when they were describing the presentation. And, long story short, as it turns out, that was the first patient ever diagnosed with NMDA receptor encephalitis in our hospital. Eventually, she received the diagnosis. But what changed my trajectory and made me want to be involved in clinical trials was sitting in the room with that patient's mother. And like any mother, she was asking all the questions that one would. Why did this happen to my daughter? Why did this happen at this point in time? What's the best treatment? And will this happen again? Is this done? Is this a once and done thing? Or could she worsen again? Could she relapse? Is there something about our genetics that was a setup for this? Just all these normal, reasonable questions. And I didn't have an answer to a single one of them for her mom. I said, well, we can try this treatment. I, as a trainee, had contacted Joseph Dalmau, of course, who discovered NMDA receptor encephalitis, and he very kindly answered this random email from, a trainee in Pennsylvania, and was helping provide me guidance, and I was passing that along, that expertise to the mom, but having to acknowledge the whole time what Joseph had acknowledged in his email, which was, we don't have a randomized trial. None of these are approved. This is just sort of what scientifically makes sense, and certainly we have to try something, right? And now, you never know these moments necessarily when you're in them, but that was the moment, right? And then a few months after that, was involved in the care of the second case of NMDA receptor encephalitis in my hospital. And then those questions were magnified in my mind. And so I became sort of obsessed with being involved in with the international experts, who were working on understanding NMDA receptor encephalitis, and was fortunate to become involved in early stages of designing this trial. The clinical trial, the ExTINGUISH trial, has in some form or another been around for over a decade, right? That's how long it takes to perfect and change and really get a proposed trial ready to bring to patients.
Yeah, and I was wondering, my next question was going to be about the ExTINGUISH trial, and if you could tell us more about how it started and where it is now.
Sure, yes. I came in after it had already been sort of been tossed around as conceptually for a few years with, Professor Daumau and Titcheler in the Netherlands, and sort of just again driven by these patient experiences I had, almost. I was obviously haunted by them, and it was becoming an obsession. Like at some point during my career, I need to be able to answer some of these questions for these patients and families. And I was at a meeting and speaking with in the hallway, grabbing a coffee and speaking with these experts and said, we really need to do this. I really, would like to devote some energy and bring whatever I can to the effort. And that's when, one of them said, well, we've been talking about this and, but we don't have a clear funding mechanism or a clear way to make that happen. And that's sort of where I thought, oh, like this is a place I can contribute, right? This is where I can bring some skills maybe to this team of experts. And so I think my role really became trying to find a way to make this happen from a funding perspective, from a bringing together teams perspective, really a lot of logistics. And I had certainly locally been involved in enrolling in some trials at that point, but otherwise it was just the sheer passion of it. And I think people saw that in me and said, okay, give it a shot. You can, here's the draft, go. And then again, we then showed it to a broader audience of experts and interested, usually neurologists around the country and the world at that point to weigh in, right? When you're getting involved in this, right? When you're the person who's spending your nights worrying about these patients, foremost in your mind is designing a trial that's incredibly safe for these patients, that can help get them to the questions, but will keep them safe throughout, right? That is, what is one's worst nightmare as a clinician physician? It's to inadvertently harm a patient somehow, right? That's the worst nightmare. That's so we spent years then sort of talking to the pediatricians, to the, geriatricians, to the adult, the people taking care of these patients at all age groups from different levels of expertise, sort of, immunologists, infectious disease folks, really trying to get, wisdom, and then incorporating it, small little changes at a time, while submitting the trial proposal to funding agencies. And sometimes months, years go by and there's no opportunity, but we eventually came across an National Institutes of Health funded program. One of the institutes is NINDS, right? This is where the neurologic and brain diseases are studied. And they have supported for many years now sites that they train and have ready to go around the US for a clinical trial. So instead of going one at a time, which is tremendously inefficient and costly, what you do is you bring a proposal to, it's called NeuroNext, the NeuroNext Clinical Trial Network, and say, hey, I have a proposal in the neurology disease space. And they review it and see if it's a good fit. And they looked at ours and said, oh my goodness, a severe disease for which there are no treatments, where it's a rare disease. So you need to have sites scattered around that could identify this. And so began that relationship, of course, leaving out a lot of pertinent details about pages and pages of grants and all these kinds of things. But they said, yeah, like this is why our network exists, to study rare brain diseases. And so that was the home that we found. And then we were also able to partner with the manufacturer of the drug that we think is in the right class of drugs, and they've helped support. And it really has been this amazing, this is the fun part, in amongst all the hours and meetings, it has been amazing to see people learn about NMDA receptor encephalitis, right? You know, individuals in the healthcare space generally, but it's a rare disease. To see them learn about it, to hear them talk about it once they've heard a patient's story, and then just bring resources together, right? So the people who have showed up and said, yes, I can contribute here, I can contribute there, are commercial laboratories offering to try to expedite positive results for this condition and get those answers to the patients and their local treating clinicians. I mean, that has been really the amazing part of all this, but yeah, it's a lift. And I hope that kind of maybe encapsulates in a few minutes the story of how I became involved. But really, the theme has been, if you're enthusiastic and dedicated and you want to help these patients, you know, you can be part of the team.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for that. And talking a little bit about NMDA receptor encephalitis, as I understand it, it was only discovered in the 2000s by the work of, as you mentioned, Joseph Dalmau. And I was wondering how has our understanding of this condition evolved since then?
Yes, you're correct. It was about 2005, I think, when Joseph Dalmau published the small case series. Again, this is a rare disease, so it was observations of, I believe it was 4 women with, you know, an acute onset of a neuropsychiatric syndrome. And the observation that he and his colleagues made was that these 4 women at the time, this of course does affect men less commonly than women, but those 4 women had ovarian dermoid cysts and teratomas. And so we now know that not everybody gets that cyst. It's not always women, but that observation allowed those women who, you know, were at probably quite high risk of this not being appreciated to have an immune basis, but more of a primary psychiatric basis. They put that together and then took it to the lab, right? Of course, Joseph Dalmau is also a physician scientist. So he and his group took that to the lab and were able to identify over the years, right, that the target that their immune system was going after was the NMDA receptor, and why might that happen, putting this story together with the tumors, which are sort of a germ cell tumor when people have these, right? And so it can differentiate to be any sort of type of cell in the body, including brain tissue, right? So this is sort of what was happening. The immune system was gaining access to the inside of that ovarian mass, seeing in there that there was some brain tissue, and appropriately knowing, you know, I sort of personify it, but appropriately knowing that brain tissue shouldn't be there. And that's enough to set a cascade into motion where the immune system is attacking that ovarian mass. These are not usually highly malignant, but that mass, and simultaneously attacking that tissue in the brain where it should be and should be left alone, right? So in a nutshell, then you have the attack. You know, subsequently, what did he and colleagues and everyone else who then joined his work learn? Well, not everybody has to have one of these ovarian tumors. We're not still entirely sure. If you don't have one of those, what does set this off for some individuals? Lots of theories about that, but started the whole field. So it's been about 20 years since that first paper. And in those 20 years, just a tremendous amount of work has been done, right? Took it from the bedside back to the bench. They have learned and now reported on really almost the entire pathophysiologic story behind this and what's happening. And that's a tremendous importance, because you have to understand the pathophysiology. You have to understand what is happening at the cellular level, the immune system level in the body, in order to then design a rational treatment approach, right? You have to have some understanding of that. And so that work, that tremendous body of work has allowed then the improving treatment piece, the clinical trial piece, to come along, because there's an understanding of what's happening.
Amazing. Yeah. And it reinforces the importance of basic research as well, to make sure we have the underlying foundation before we move on to
This is the
trials.
perfect story, right? People should use this as the example in 20 years time, right? You know, identification by really incredible clinical acumen, bedside care, take it back, identify it, grow the phenotype, right? Then raised awareness once it was described and published in the literature, and And, people were tirelessly from Dalmau's group and others going around the world, telling these stories. Hey, look out for these patients. And inevitably in those early days, when you would give a lecture, someone would come out of the audience. Oh my goodness, I think I had a patient with this, or I have one currently. How do I test it? Right. So you raise the awareness in the medical community, continued to do the science to understand exactly what was going on. But believe it or not, so now in that 20-year time frame, I think awareness is now widespread, which is a wonderful accomplishment, right? So most neurologists, by the time they complete their training, know about NMDA receptor encephalitis for sure. But what has happened now is all of this moment of how do we save these lives in the moment? What sort of theoretical treatments should we give? We're now at a point in time where it's critical. It's a critical point in time, because now there's sort of these clinical pathways of expert consensus based on the scientific rationale, but saying, okay, so we should probably give these treatments. And now we're getting in the habit of giving these treatments. And so this is where we need to be very, very careful. And so when we as a trial team talk to physicians, they say, I already know how to treat this condition, right? Because there's these clinical pathways, we've had improving, arguably, outcomes, separate conversations, still a ton of room to go, but at least these patients are making it out of the hospital, right? Now we could debate, is that because of the treatments we're giving, or is it because of the wonderful supportive care and the ICU teams preventing infections and stuff? So that's a question we aim to answer with the trial. But certainly I've fallen victim to this too. I told you about those first two patients that I treated well over a decade ago now. Well, then when patient 3 and patient 4 and patient 5 came along, I tended to repeat what I had done. And so long as those patients continued to make it out of the hospital, I sort of said, okay, I know how to treat this now, right? But the key is you can never lose sight of the fact that those treatments were sort of borrowed from other fields and used because something needed to be done, for patients. But those are not rigorously studied in this disease. And there is the hopeful recall bias of physicians sort of wanting to say the patient made it out of the hospital and then maybe they're back to work and doing well. And so it must have perhaps been related to what we did, right? So this is the dangerous sort of era that we're in now for all of autoimmune encephalitis and much of autoimmune neurology, which expands beyond autoimmune encephalitis as well. And so this is where we have sort of one at a time, thoughtful discussions with clinicians, with patient families, because usually the patients are too sick up front to have the discussion, and say, I just had a discussion not less than a month ago, talking about an off-label treatment with a family member who called the trial hotline that we have. And that family member said, I said, there's no actual FDA approved treatments for this condition that your loved one has. And they said, that's impossible. Of course there are. That's what's being recommended to us at the moment. And I said, well, no, they're not actually FDA approved. We've never had, a clinical trial to gain FDA approval. And the failure, they just kept saying, no, that's impossible. They must be, right? And so it was an interesting moment. And so the onus is on us as clinicians at this point to now say, okay, we need to do better. We need to have data. And this is my dream, right? Sometime before I retire, I want to be able to walk in the room and hand that family member data, high quality data, and say, this is something that has gone through all the rigor of a clinical trial, and that the people that had this condition before your loved one worked hard, they participated, and now here's an answer for you on a pathway, right? It's a long road with these things, but we have a very clear first direction, right? I just want that one answer.
That's a great dream to have, and I hope we do see that day, So yeah, going back to kind of your own experience, you've established one of the few dedicated autoimmune neurology clinics in the US. How has this specialized approach improved patient care compared to traditional neurology settings?
speaking of studying, this is probably something we need to study more. I can tell you what we do differently, and how we try to contribute to better care, because certainly when I was a trainee, there really weren't a ton of these. There was only one official fellowship in the United States that you could even train in. And it wasn't clear then how one would roll this out to other academic medical centers beyond that location. So honestly, a lot of it's all about time spent with the patient. We have set up our clinics in as everybody knows, these are challenging times, but we have set up our clinics to allow us to spend time talking to the patients and the families. As it turns out, if you're able to do that, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do in the current economics worldwide, very often these patients and their loved ones will tell you what is going on with their own body when you ask thoughtful questions, and you can start there and save a ton on diagnostics just by listening. But again, we know this from other fields, from other study. If you can't spend the time, if Big Brother's over here saying you have 15 minutes per patient, the waste will show up in unnecessary testing and delays to diagnosis, right? So our clinics are set up in a way, and we like to think our style of questioning and listening is set up in a way to allow the story to rise to the top based on the history and experience. So that's one thing we focus on a lot. The other is, we do for people who present critically very suddenly, like with NMDA receptor encephalitis. One is often a student last week and on their way to the ICU next week, right? So we have set up, and I've now seen other hospitals doing this, which makes me happy. And I'm sure there were some doing it before, and certainly where I did my fellowship at the Mayo Clinic, they were doing it and offering this service, a subspecialty consultation service where we sort of drop everything and we'll run into the hospital if that hospital team thinks that they have a person presenting with some sort of neuroimmune condition. And often the second most common thing when we get those calls is neuroinfectious, an atypical infection as well. And so we work very closely with our neuroinfectious disease trained docs as well, but we will come into the hospital and do what, again, it's time. The hospital teams may have a very busy service. And so what we're able to do by offering that subspecialty consultation is take 2-3 hours. Get the full history. Often, again, it might not be from the patient because they're too sick. So gather all those records, talk to folks who know them, who can tell us the story, synthesize that together, and then use the expertise that we've trained so many years to gain, right? To say, okay, this is a point in favor of it being immune. This is a point against. Put all of that data together, and then order rational focus testing, right? We're a bit spoiled at the University of Utah because we have a large commercial laboratory on our campus, one of the big 4 in the US, it's AREP. So we also have the advantage of rapid turnaround for tests, right? Where we're not waiting a week for anything. We're quite spoiled. We can get it in 24, 48 hours. So that patient's still in the hospital. So we're using that immediate feedback to then drive diagnosis. But this requires relationship building, right? When I first came here, right? I didn't train here. I didn't know anyone in the state, let alone the hospital. I met with my department and said, here's my training. Here's my vision. When you all are, spending your time as an attending or consultant, whatever the terminology might be, on the inpatient hospital service, please, if you see a patient where you think it's an undiagnosed patient, right? This happens more than people talk about. Or you think it's immune system, you have just one clue here and there, please call us, right? And so, on our end, we need to be useful to that inpatient team. And so I think we are useful because we spend the time that is simply not available in our overloaded hospitals worldwide now, right? We spend the time, we do the testing, we arrange for rapid follow-up once they're discharged as well, which is another weak link in most any hospital system internationally, right? Once that patient is well enough to leave the hospital, what next? Arguably, that's where the hard work starts and all the support is needed, right? So we arrange for rapid follow-up. multidisciplinary approach. These are some of the things we do, but it's just like anything, it's creating a culture. It's sort of proving to your colleagues, your very busy colleagues, that there's value in this, and so they incorporate it into how they're approaching that undiagnosed patient when they arrive in the hospital, knowing that you're a resource there. I've been fortunate that they sort of welcomed it with open arms here, because it takes an extra phone call on their part, a consult to tell the story, so that's a lot of what we've been done. Obviously, I'm proud of it, because I think, rewind over a decade ago, or when I was a trainee, and I would look back and go, well, what happened to that undiagnosed patient when they left? Right. And these are I call them the ghosts of patients past, right? That sort of drive us to make change. And so that's a very important part. And this is a change, right? If we dive into sort of the culture of medicine and specialties, traditional sort of historic practice of maybe neuroimmunology, of the experts who take care of MS and stuff, that's a largely outpatient practice, right? These docs are devoting all of their energy to those populations, so often might not have been running over to the hospital as much, right? But autoimmune neurology patients, these acute antibody attacks, these autoinflammatory syndromes, these atypical presentations of infections, increasingly autoimmune neurologists are very comfortable going back and forth, right? And this is what we're building into the training and the culture. Many autoimmune neurologists are also increasingly on the hospitalist service themselves, right? Because they enjoy taking care of these very ill, sometimes not clear what's going on patients. And so it's a bit of a shift from the doctor level of how they're approaching their career in this space when they have autoimmune neurology interests and training. They're adapting their career and their inpatient, outpatient mix to enable them to take care of these patients from time of presentation through years later, right? So all of that sort of stuff is a work in progress. These are the things that we discuss when we all get together at meetings. Like, okay, how can we tweak this? What can we do better? This involves, you can imagine, from the ground up, talking to the people hiring you to try and explain this vision, right?
That's fantastic. Yeah, there's so much in there. Like, it's so important about the way you ask questions, the patient-centeredness, multidisciplinary teams, and of course the follow-up. So there's so much in there, and I think you're setting quite a standard there. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And yeah, moving on to a more kind of hopeful note, what new and emerging types of treatments for autoimmune encephalitis do you find most promising?
Well, right now, funny you should ask. There's this thing called the ExTINGUISH trial. So that's the trial I've been sort of alluding to, right? It's the ExTINGUISH trial for NMDA receptor encephalitis. This is the one that has been funded by NIH, NINDS, and the Neuronext Clinical Trial Network. So this is enrolling. We're not quite halfway enrolled yet, and so that's what I view as really the hope. So what is this trial, right? I'll tell you some of the details if you want to hear. So
Please, yeah.
It's what's called a phase 2B trial, which gets into some of the clinical trial details that I never even understood when I was a resident. But it means, we're looking to get a compound, a drug approved for the treatment. Now, usually you would go through phase 3, and then phase 4, I think, really refers to it's been approved, but how's it doing out there following up long term when it's implemented outside of all the tight controls that happen in a clinical trial. In rare disease and ultra rare disease, which is encephalitis, this is a phase 2B trial, may well be a pivotal trial, right? It just sort of depends on what's found. So we're looking at a compound that's called inebilizumab. And this targets the antibody-producing cells in the body, the B cells. And it targets a specific marker on the outside of these B cells. And the idea is, if we can target those cells that are making antibodies, we'll get the misbehaving ones that are making NMDA receptor-targeted antibodies, because that's what's causing NMDA receptor encephalitis. The immune system is attacking NMDA receptors in the brain. And so there's that piece of this trial, which is very exciting. And this compound, inebilizumab, is approved actually to treat other diseases. So it has gone through the regulatory bodies. For example, it's probably most widely known in neurology spaces as an approved treatment for neuromyelitis optica spectrum disease. And it has subsequently been approved in other sort of more rheumatologic kind of conditions. But again, nothing's approved in autoimmune encephalitis. And so we're studying it for that. And that's a very exciting piece. So in the trial, again, I alluded earlier to all of the design considerations that went in. It's a part of the treatments that people may receive if they enroll in the trial. But we designed the trial such that every single person who enrolls in the trial is receiving multiple immunotherapies at different times. And this was so, again, all of us could take what we're currently doing, what we think is the right thing, but has never been prospectively rigorously studied around the world. And we put that all in there, but still left room for this question of, should we be giving this B cell therapy or not? And also at what time point, right? So the way it's designed now, people present acutely with this condition. And at centers with experts, they usually treat empirically before that result even comes back, confirming that it's NMDA receptor antibodies in the cerebrospinal fluid. So what we say is, yeah, absolutely continue to treat this as a neurologic emergency, because it is. The immune system's attacking the brain. And so participants can have received IV methylprednisolone, intravenous immune globulin, and or plasma exchange, right? And that's often ongoing when their treating clinician gets the phone call, hey, it's positive for NMDA receptor encephalitis. You guessed right, based on the presentation of this patient. And by the way, did you know you can enroll them in a clinical trial, right? So those first-line immunotherapies are on board. And at that point, it is worth saying, right, obviously the loved ones are in crisis, right? These people were healthy days ago, usually young, healthy people, and often they're now in the ICU, right? And the presentation is one of psychosis, and they tend to attack the people that are closest to them, right? And lash out and say just incredibly frightening things. The hallucinations that these patients have are like no other I've ever seen. They are deeply terrifying to the affected patient. And so you can imagine that the patient's not remembering any of this. They're not able to form memories while this is going on, sort of fortunately. But you can imagine who's taking the brunt of it. It's these loved ones. So now they are in the hospital. They're having doctors come in saying, I think it might be this, could be that, could be this, throwing these first-line immunotherapies appropriately, we think, at the patient. And then they come in and say, hey, there's a clinical trial. This is what we walk into. So then we say, okay, next, while those first-line immunotherapies are still in your system, because depending which one we're talking about, it's weeks, they stay in your system, right? Next, do you want to participate in this trial? And we'll either give inebilizumab or we won't. At 2 weeks apart, day 1 and day 15, say, after you would enroll in the trial. And then at day 22, so like week 3, when the first-line immunotherapies are still in there, everyone gets another sort of round dose of intravenous immune globulin. And then fast forward another couple weeks, at week 6, if that patient is still not improving as the treating doc or clinician would like to see, we can then throw another round of immunotherapies at them. This one is cyclophosphamide or Cytoxan. It's been around for many years. So you can see it's very complicated with many overlapping treatments. So these patients are on, depending at what point in time, 2 to 4 immunotherapies in their system. And so we were trying to then go into the room and explain this to these families. And it's so much on the families and loved ones. It's a lot, but that's roughly what the trial does on the inpatient setting. And then we follow the participants up to 96 weeks afterward, and we're looking at clinician scores and questionnaires, because we know there's a lot of bias in how we're approaching these patients. We ask questions of the caregivers, because we know 100% of the caregivers are traumatized. And we're asking them for their input too on recovery not just sort of how they're doing in their perceptions, but how do they think their loved ones are recovering. And then we're doing a lot of cognitive testing of the patient themselves, because what we haven't really gotten into yet in our discussion is that it's one thing to get these patients out of the hospital, but that is really just when the work begins, because the cognitive recovery is prolonged, the mood, the depression, even sort of the remnants of that initial psychosis, the rebuilding of self and life and identity. I mean, these things take a tremendous amount of time. The immune system, the inflammation to the nervous system, right? We know these things take months to years. And so we follow very, very closely up to 96 weeks in the trial. And this is, I think, clinically probably what everyone aspires to do too, but outside of a trial just simply does not often happen for most people in the world. So that is a fun part of the trials, being able to deliver that to the participants. But that's a rough overview of what we're doing. So there is a drug that we're studying to see that is wide, similar drugs to enablizumab are being widely used off label, is the reality of what's happening, right? And used, in a very uncontrolled fashion, because again, there's nothing approved, there's nothing rigorously studied. So docs can give it at any sort of dose or interval. They can layer on what we call the kitchen sink of immunotherapies, which is not without risk, right? We are just annihilating the immune system of these folks when we do that and just throw tons on. So that's the drug piece, but we are also collecting the blood samples that are done to monitor. We're building a biorepository that, de-identified, that can be used to learn more about the condition in the future, right? We're learning so much from the cognitive scores of these bedside measures we're doing. So that is truly the legacy, very exciting part, that yes, the first thing we will get is the answer to, should we continue to use drugs in this class, right? We'll get that answer at the end. But then we have years of other questions we can answer because of the data that's being collected, right? And that, to me, is incredibly exciting. So, will we be able to answer the questions that first mother asked me, right? Well, hopefully we'll be able to answer, are you proposing the right treatment for my daughter? But in addition, why did this happen? Can we predict who it will happen to again? Can we predict who gets it mildly, who gets it really severe right out of the gate, right? Like that is just really exciting to all of us involved in running this trial, to get multiple answers to all of the important questions and go from there.
That's amazing. Yeah, it does come back down to data at the end of the day. We normally think, the trials are for finding the answer, but actually there's so much we learn along the way, so much data we're collecting in the process of the trial. That's fantastic. So yeah, we're coming to the end of this podcast episode. So just to kind of finish off, what advice would you give to someone designing a clinical trial for the first time?
Make a lot of friends who know what they're doing, who bring expertise, right? There is no clinical trial that's run by a group of 10 people or even a group of 50 people, right? The amount of expertise and work to do it right, to do it safely, is really, I mean, I'm a doc. I couldn't possibly have appreciated it before I was fortunate enough to be involved in this. And that's what allows me to sleep at night, right? There's this tremendous team of people who have been doing this for decades, who truly know their craft. How do you keep people safe? How do you follow up every single piece of data and loose ends that are out there, to inform that as well. And it's a tremendous undertaking. We have a 24-hour hotline that we run just to sort of make sure that no patients left behind, that nothing's missed, that a local trial site study coordinator can call with a question or a problem, or help get a patient who's now back home transportation to their visit, every little detail. I would say it's, I think, a tremendous undertaking, but of the things that I've been involved with in my career, just the most immediately satisfying, because it's so very clearly critically important, right? I want to answer those questions. We all want to answer those questions. I want to know what we're doing for every single one of these patients is the right, best thing to be doing.
Amazing.
So do it. Maybe that's my answer. Do it. Get involved in the clinical trials. I mean, you're making me think of it. One more thing, right, is if I'm proposing treatments to a patient, this is what I've changed about my practice, especially all these rare disease patients. What I'm now doing periodically is going on clinicaltrials.gov to make sure that when I go in to propose a treatment algorithm to essentially every disease I treat, except that NMO one I mentioned does not have an approved drug. So I'm going on periodically to make sure that there is not a trial, because if I don't at least provide that information, right? Knowledge is power. If I don't provide the information, the opportunity to the patient and their loved ones, am I really providing informed consent to what they're about to do, right? To try to treat their illness? I don't think so. That's really the thing that has maybe changed my clinical practice the most, is that I can't walk in there and be paternalistic. I like to think I never was, but I can't say, like, this is how I treated the last 10 people, so this is your treatment plan. It needs to be an ongoing, brand new discussion every single clinic visit, right? And so what do? All my rare disease patients, they're now actually trained. They half the time they ask me before I can bring it up. They know the closing of our visit is what's new, what's going on, what is the research, and what is the hope for the future, right? So I have to then, if it's been a minute since I saw someone with a different rare condition, like, I don't know, stiff person syndrome, I go in very quickly, 30 seconds. Okay, are there any new trials? Okay, let me talk to them about these. And then they'll have questions, I hope. And we can say, might you qualify, might you not? But even if they don't qualify, what you want the most when you have rare disease is to know that there's hope and work is being done, and it's going to be better for the person who comes after you, right? So that has completely turned my approach to every single clinic visit on its head. I always make sure to look and see what's being done and can they participate.
Amazing. And I love your passion, by the way. I just want to say this, it really comes through. Thank you so much.
It's from the patients and the families, right? Like you
Yeah.
can't walk out of a room when someone's desperately looking at you going, what do you mean you don't know how to treat this? What do you mean there's no approved, right? It's haunting, right?
Yeah. Is there anything else that we've discussed a lot today? Is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you feel should be mentioned?
It's a dangerous question. Ask me. Have you not gathered that I could talk about this for hours? I think it is really, it's hard to enroll in these trials. And I would say that funding agencies, whatever they might be, if we interest pharmaceutical companies in running a trial of their own for a compound they think might work, or governmental funding agencies, or nonprofits or benefactors, I think all of those people know we're talking about a very rare class of diseases, right? In our clinics, we're seeing at most common, usually 1 in 500,000 to more rare. And the hardest part here is not so much identifying the patients. I think we've got that dialed in. The hardest part is getting the information on these opportunities to some very busy clinicians, right? That's also very, very challenging. And so when I'm trying to figure out how do we enroll this trial faster so we can get the answers faster, this is no doubt the question that comes to everyone involved in rare disease clinical trials, not just in an encephalitis or neurologic disease, but that is, how do we get the word out? How do we check our own current practice patterns, make sure they're not biased based on the last 3 patients we saw? And how do we make sure that we're actually treating the patient in front of us to the best of our ability, but we're also treating the 5 future patients, right? That's I think the imperative. And And so if anyone listening has ideas on how to do that, we're always looking to make sure that there's not a patient, and we've had this happen several times, who finds out later, right? And that's heartbreaking. We've had families call and say, wait, what do you mean I can't enroll? Why didn't I know about this? Why didn't my medical team tell me? Right. So that's another thing that haunts us. So I always, that's the important part. And yes, all the funders are looking at that. Can we, as a clinical community, as a patient community, say, no, we will find the patients. We will. It's important enough. These rare diseases are so important. We know this is the challenge, but we're going to come together and we're going to do it, right?
That's a brilliant call to arms, that. Thank you so much. All right, so we've come to the end of this podcast with Dr. Stacey Clardy. I'd like to thank Stacey for sharing your valuable time with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you
And
for
I'd like
having
to
me.
thank,
It's an honor.
yeah, and I'd like to thank the listener for listening and watching. We hope you found this episode of the Encephalitis podcast helpful. Encephalitis International is here to help and support in whatever way we can. For more information, as well as our contact details, please visit our website, www.encephalitis.info, and together we can achieve our aim of ending death and disability from encephalitis. You can also find all the information you need in the podcast description. As always, if you can support our work, we would be extremely grateful. Please visit www.encephalitis.info/donate. Thank you again, and see you next time on the Encephalitis podcast. From Stacey and me, thank you and goodbye.